A prophet's visions ignited a firestorm of violence. In the final moments, there was no salvation, only the cruelty of an unrelenting system. Nat Turner was a slave, a preacher, and a man who claimed to hear the voice of God. In the summer of 1831, driven by what he believed were divine commands, he led a bloody rebellion against the institution of slavery in Southampton County, Virginia. His execution, following the rebellion, would become a grotesque testament to the fear and rage of a nation that feared the collapse of its foundations. His last days were filled with the agony of a condemned man and the humiliation of a justice system designed to break him. In the stifling heat of summer, the sweat clung to Nat Turner's skin like a second layer, his body trembling, but not from the heat. His every breath was shallow, his heart pounding in his chest with the desperate rhythm of a man who feared the world would collapse beneath him. There was no room for air in his lungs, no space for anything but the weight of his conviction. A heavy, suffocating burden that consumed him in the darkest hours. His thoughts were not his own. They were the voice of something far greater, far more terrifying. He had heard it, felt it, seen it, a divine summons that clawed at the fabric of his sanity. The visions began to crawl into his mind like serpents. They twisted his thoughts, coiled around his soul, until he could see only fire and blood. "Strike down the wicked," they told him. "Bring the wrath of God to the earth." The air around him seemed thick with the stench of something rotting, not the land or the earth, but something deeper, a corruption that threatened to unravel his very being. His hands trembled uncontrollably as they gripped the edges of the wooden pew, the dampness of his palms slipping on the rough surface. His legs shook beneath him, as if the weight of his own body were becoming unbearable, his muscles aching under the strain of a fever that gnawed at him from the inside out. His skin, slick with sweat and fever, felt hot to the touch, a searing heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the fire of righteousness burning from within. He could feel it deep in his chest, in his bones, a fire that both purged and consumed him. The words came from his lips, barely his own. They rumbled from his chest in guttural sounds, a language that had not been spoken by any man in centuries. His eyes were wide, delirious, wild with the fevered thoughts racing through his head. His body swayed with each uttered phrase, each breath as shallow and broken as his sanity. His visions swam before him, images of the dead, of the wicked, of slaughter and suffering. They were visions of those who had wronged him, wronged his people, but more than that, they were promises. Promises of revenge, promises of a reckoning. Turner's body, once a vessel of life, had become an instrument of divine wrath. His every step felt like a burden, his body jerking in fits of feverish spasms, his teeth clenched, jaw tight against the pain that rippled through his aching muscles, his vision blurred by the fever that gnawed at him from within. The land around him seemed to reflect the sickness within him. The crops withered in the field, the sky darkened with ominous clouds. The earth had begun to sour, as though the very land could sense the coming storm. His flesh, once sturdy and strong, had become a vessel of decay, consumed by the heat of his divine purpose. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red, as though he hadn't slept in days. His mind raced with feverish thoughts, his vision clouded with divine fire, his heart racing with dread and anticipation. The voice of God, or what he believed to be God, spoke to him again, louder this time. It rumbled in his chest, shaking him to his core. "You are my instrument," it commanded. "The time has come. The earth will burn. The wicked will be cleansed." But with the divine came the torment. His own skin, slick with fever, felt like it was burning from the inside out. His mind, once sharp and focused, had become a twisted mess of visions and half-formed thoughts. He could see the faces of the dead, hear their screams echoing in the dark recesses of his mind. The weight of his mission pressed down on him like an iron vice, his limbs aching, his mind reeling from the burden of his divine calling. The other slaves gathered around him, their faces a mixture of fear and awe, but none dared to stop him. He was no longer a man among them. He had become something else, something divine, something cursed. His body trembled under the weight of the calling, his skin flushed and fevered. His eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to see beyond the present, beyond the world that surrounded them. His hands, now trembling violently, reached out to touch the others, but they recoiled. They had seen the change in him, the madness that burned in his eyes like fire. His mouth was dry, cracked, and yet he could not stop speaking. "They will die," he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "The wicked will die by my hand." His body lurched as the words left his mouth, a violent tremor that rattled his frame. His hands clutched at his chest as if trying to hold in the fire that burned inside him. But there was no holding it back now. His mind, fragile and splintering, could no longer contain the visions that plagued him. His skin burned with fevered heat, a fever that was more than just sickness. It was a sign, a seal of his divine purpose. As the night of rebellion drew near, Turner's body became a canvas for the agony he would soon unleash. Fevered and consumed, he was barely able to stand, his legs weak beneath him, his eyes clouded with fever and madness. He felt himself slipping, losing touch with the world he once knew. But the visions, they were clear. The fire, the blood, the violence, it was all coming, and he was the instrument of it. His mind raced with images of retribution, of the flood of death that would wash away the wicked. And in that moment, he could hear the divine whisper again, louder than ever before, echoing in his mind like the crashing of thunder. "It is time," it said, and he obeyed. The night of August 21st, 1831, began as the air seemed to shudder, thick with the promise of blood and fire. The dark sky hung low over Southampton County, the moon shrouded in a mist that clung to the earth like a blanket of sin. Turner and his followers moved through the shadows, their faces grim with a resolve that bordered on madness. There was no turning back now. The words of God, the divine commands that had tormented Turner's soul for so long, had become actions. Terrible, irrevocable actions that would stain their hands forever. But there was no fear in their eyes, only the fire of righteous vengeance, the kind of fervor that could make a man believe he was carrying out a divine calling, even if it meant walking straight into hell. Their first victim was a brutal farmer, a man whose very name had become a symbol of the wickedness they sought to punish. He had lived his life with cruelty, treating men and women like cattle, his hands stained with the sweat and blood of his labor force. Turner's followers moved swiftly and silently, like phantoms in the night, their bare feet barely making a sound on the damp soil. The first blow was swift, the sharp bite of a machete sinking deep into the farmer's throat before he could utter a single cry. His body slumped forward, crumpling into the earth, blood spilling from the gaping wound in a steady stream, soaking the ground beneath him, darkening the soil in a defiant act of vengeance. The men stood over the body for a moment, the sickening scent of fresh blood filling their nostrils, thick and metallic, as if the very land had drunk deeply of it. Turner's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest heaving as he looked down at the man he had killed. The blood pooled around the farmer's head, staining the earth, turning the once innocent soil into something vile, something defiled. It was a victory, a sign that they were not weak, not slaves anymore. They were the hand of judgment. But even as the blood soaked into the ground, Turner felt a wave of sickness rise in his stomach. The flesh of the dead was sticky, suffocating, and the sound of the farmer's body hitting the earth still echoed in Turner's mind. It was a victory, but it tasted of rot. They moved on, their steps quickening, as the night unfolded before them like a dark tapestry of destruction. The weight of what they had done began to sink into their bones. Every step felt heavier, the air thicker. The screams of the dead seemed to hang in the air, a constant reminder of the blood they had spilled. Each man's hands were coated in it, their fingers slick with the viscous substance, their nails caked with the dirt and gore of their victim. The scent of death clung to them, suffocating until it became a part of them. A new scent, one that lingered in their nostrils, in their clothing, in the very fibers of their souls. It was a mark they could not wash away. As they moved through the countryside, their bodies began to betray them. Once, they had felt unstoppable, like instruments of divine purpose, their strength drawn directly from the hand of God. But now, with every new atrocity, their bodies began to slow, the weight of their actions pressing down on them like an invisible hand. Turner's own body ached, his legs stiffening with each step. The bloodied machete in his grip felt like a foreign object, too heavy, too slick with death. His stomach churned with nausea, a sickness that had little to do with hunger. No, this was the sickness of guilt, of the horror that now gnawed at him from the inside out. Turner's thoughts turned inward, his mind unraveling with each new death. He had believed this was his mission, to bring the wrath of God to the earth, to strike down the wicked and free his people from their chains. But as the blood piled up, as the bodies of the dead continued to fall, Turner felt the weight of his actions like a leaden cloak. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, his eyes darting around the dark landscape as if he were being hunted by demons of his own making. The faces of the dead seemed to follow him, haunting him, their eyes wide with the terror of their last moments. Were they innocent, or had they too been wicked? Turner's mind spiraled. The lines between the divine and the damned blurred, and he found himself lost in a maze of confusion, unsure of what he had set into motion. As they moved on, their bodies slowing, their minds cracking under the strain, Turner's internal suffering deepened. The pain of what he had unleashed pressed on him, a weight he could not shake. His hands trembled violently as he wiped his brow, feeling the slickness of sweat mixed with the sticky residue of blood. His body, once a vessel of purpose, now felt like a prison, shackled by the enormity of the violence he had committed. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if the very earth was protesting the bloodshed that had stained it. And still, he marched forward, leading his followers toward the next slaughter, the next victim. The zeal that had once burned bright now flickered like a dying flame. Fear mingled with faith, doubt with divine purpose. The rebellion had begun, but its cost was becoming clearer with every passing moment. And in Turner's mind, the voices of the dead whispered louder, their cries for justice echoing through the night. The night air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke, as if the earth itself had soaked up the agony of 100 years. The sky above, heavy with oppressive clouds, seemed to close in around Nat Turner like a dark, suffocating shroud. The rebellion that had begun with such fiery conviction had begun to sputter out like a candle in a storm. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled violently, the fever that consumed him turning his body into a vessel of decay. His skin, slick with sweat and blood, felt like it was crawling with something unseen, a sickness gnawing at him from the inside, devouring his strength, his spirit. The forest around him was alive with the sound of crunching leaves and twigs, the whisper of the wind carrying with it the distant cries of his followers, their voices faltering, scattered. The men who had once followed him with unshakable faith now stumbled, broken and unsure. Fear had begun to grip them, and their resolve crumbled under the weight of their own doubt. The world seemed to blur at the edges, like a fever dream, the once clear path ahead now obscured by the creeping fog of despair. Turner's breath came in shallow gasps, each inhalation like fire in his lungs. His body ached, his legs heavy and unsteady beneath him, the ground beneath his feet giving way as if the very earth was rejecting him. He had led them to this collapse. The weight of his actions, the blood he had spilled, had become an unbearable burden that seemed to pull him deeper into the mire. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, that gnawing emptiness, a sickening realization that the divine purpose he had once believed in had become a curse. The stench of death was thick in the air, hanging like a shadow, its presence suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. Turner could hear the sounds of soldiers in the distance, the rhythmic stomp of boots, the clanking of metal, the murmurs of men and women searching, hunting, closing in. Each step they took seemed to echo in his skull, a constant reminder of the inevitable doom that awaited him. They were coming for him, for all of them. The rebellion was over. He had failed. But still, even as his body trembled with the weight of exhaustion, his mind clung to a delusional thread of hope. He had seen the vision. He had heard the voice. God had spoken to him, had commanded him to rise, to strike down the wicked. This was not the end. It cannot be, he thought, the thought flickering like a dying ember in his chest. I was chosen. This was my purpose. There is more to be done. But the thought felt weak now, a ghost of the certainty that had driven him to commit such horrors. His fingers gripped the machete in his hand, slick with the blood of his victims. but it was no longer the weapon of a righteous man. It was a reminder of his failure, of the judgment that now sat heavy in his chest. His legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to the ground. He landed hard on the damp earth, his breath escaping in a ragged gasp. The pain in his chest was unbearable, like a weight had settled on top of him, and the world spun as if he were drowning in a sea of blood. The night sky above him seemed to swirl, the stars mocking him from far off, distant, unreachable. His eyes darted around, but the world was a blur of shadows and darkness, the sounds of his followers' desperate cries muffled in his ears. In his delirium, Turner saw faces, the faces of the dead, their hollow eyes staring at him accusingly. He could hear their whispers, soft and insistent, just beyond the edge of his hearing. "You have failed," they seemed to say. "You have failed them all." His head swam with feverish visions, the blood of the dead, the eyes of the soldiers who would kill him, the twisted, contorted shapes of his own soul. The walls of his mind seemed to close in, and the weight of his actions pressed down on him, each breath a torment. His body had become an enemy, betraying him with every labored movement. The once mighty preacher, the vessel of divine judgment, had become nothing more than a broken man, crawling through the mud like an animal. He struggled to his feet, his vision swimming as he staggered through the dense forest. The trees around him seemed to close in, their gnarled branches like twisted fingers reaching for him, threatening to pull him deeper into the darkness. His legs shook beneath him, but he pressed on, driven by something he could not explain. The fever gnawed at his mind, distorting reality, twisting everything around him. The soldiers were getting closer, their voices growing louder, their steps more urgent. They would find him soon, but in his fevered state, he could not bring himself to stop. There was something still there, something in the pit of his soul that told him he was not done, that this was not the end. But it was. He could feel it, creeping like a shadow over his heart. The world around him was dissolving, his thoughts scattered, and the voice that had once guided him now seemed like a distant memory, a haunting echo that faded with each step. He was no longer sure what he had been fighting for, no longer sure of his purpose. The rebellion had burned bright, but now the fire was dying, flickering and choking on its own smoke. Turner stumbled into a clearing, his chest heaving with each ragged breath, the world around him spinning in a sickening blur. The sound of footsteps drew nearer, sharp and clear. He turned, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, but all he could see were shadows closing in on him. He reached out, his hand trembling, grasping at the air, as if trying to catch the last fleeting remnants of his purpose. But there was nothing left, only the cold, empty weight of his failure. The soldiers emerged from the trees, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. They saw him, a broken, fevered man, his hands trembling as he held onto the machete like a child clutching a toy. They had no mercy left for him. There was no divine judgment to save him now. There was only the cold, hard reality of his failure and the crushing inevitability of his fate. As Turner was dragged away, his body racked with the pain of his own guilt. His mind still raced, still clung to the delusion that there was something greater ahead. But the reality was clear. There would be no judgment, no vengeance. There was only the end, the bitter end of a prophet who had fallen. The sun beat down like an unrelenting fire, casting long shadows across the dirt-packed streets of Jerusalem, Virginia, as Nat Turner was dragged through the town like some forsaken animal. His limbs were bound by thick, coarse ropes that cut into his raw skin with each excruciating movement. Shackles, cold and unforgiving, clinked with every shuffling step, each one dragging him deeper into a hell of his own making. The divine calling he had once felt in his bones, the message of liberation he had so fiercely believed in, had turned to dust in his mouth. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and filth, not just from the grueling heat, but from the stench of betrayal, of his own failure. Turner's body, once sturdy with the power of righteousness, had withered into something unrecognizable, a broken shell of the man who had led an uprising, a prophet who had stirred fire in the hearts of his fellow slaves. His skin, once firm and taut, now hung loosely from his gaunt frame, each bone sharp under the sweat-slickened surface. His eyes were wide, frantic, but the light that had once blazed with divine fury had dimmed, leaving only a hollow reflection of the man he had been. His lips, cracked and parched, trembled with each breath, but there was no strength left to speak. His breath came in ragged gasps, a faint wheeze escaping his chest with each strained exhale. The hands that had once wielded the machete with the certainty of a holy mission now hung limply at his sides, the blood from his earlier victories still staining his fingers, the cloying scent of death lingering in the air around him like a foul perfume. His feet, bare and caked with dirt, scraped against the rough cobblestones, leaving behind a trail of blood and grime, the warm wetness of it seeping through his thin rags. His once proud bearing was now nothing more than a sickly slump, the weight of his physical suffering and moral collapse weighing him down to the ground. Around him, the jeering crowd gathered like vultures, their eyes wide with disbelief, curiosity, and something darker, a primal glee at the fall of a once mighty man. Children, their faces twisted with excitement, laughed as they threw dirt and stones, their innocent hands stained by the same blood that had once been the sacred seal of Turner's divine purpose. Their mothers clutched them tightly, whispering words of caution, but there was no hiding the glee in their eyes. He was no longer the prophet, no longer the embodiment of divine wrath. He was a prisoner, a man broken by the very system he had tried to destroy. Turner's heart hammered against his chest, his pulse a frantic rhythm in his ears, but it was not from fear. No, not anymore. He had been stripped of his dignity, of his divine purpose. He was just a man now, his soul exposed, raw and naked to the world. His very being had been laid bare, a public spectacle for all to see. His spirit had been torn apart in the streets, humiliated in ways that words could never convey. He could feel the weight of the eyes upon him, the stares that burned into his flesh, and they were not the eyes of reverence, of fear, or awe. No, they were the eyes of mockery, the eyes of a world that had turned against him. The guards who had captured him were rough, pushing him forward with none of the care they had shown when they had first encountered him. They shoved him, their hands grabbing at his thin, bony frame, pulling him through the streets as if he were nothing more than a criminal, a thing to be discarded. The ropes that bound him cut into his wrists, the friction raw and painful, but it was nothing compared to the aching hollowness inside him, the gnawing emptiness that threatened to consume him whole. He had once been something greater, a man chosen by God, but now he was just a thing to be ridiculed, to be broken, to be forgotten. The prison cell that awaited him was cold, its damp stone walls pressing in around him like a tomb, its air thick with the smell of decay and sweat. The floor was filthy, streaked with mud and blood, and the straw in the corner was soiled, long forgotten by the rats that scurried beneath it. He was thrown into the corner with no care, the weight of his body hitting the cold stone with a sickening thud. His limbs buckled beneath him, but he could not rise. His legs trembled, too weak to hold him upright. His breath came in gasps, ragged and desperate. His body ached from the journey, from the blows he had received, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his soul. The man who had once believed himself to be the hand of God was now nothing more than a broken thing, a puppet in the hands of the very world he had fought against. He lay there, staring at the walls of his prison, his thoughts a tangle of confusion and regret. The visions that had once filled his mind with divine purpose now seemed like distant memories, faded and twisted by the weight of his failure. He had heard the voice of God. He had seen the flames of judgment, the wrath of the heavens. But now he could see nothing but darkness. His mind, once sharp and clear, had become clouded with doubt and terror. Had it all been a lie? Had he truly been chosen? Or was he just another man, doomed to live and die in the dirt like the others? The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside his cell, growing louder with each passing moment. The trial was coming. The end was near. Turner's body trembled, his chest tightening in fear. But it was not fear of the executioners. No, it was the fear of what awaited him. The final judgment, the public spectacle that would seal his fate. He would be paraded before the crowd, stripped of his dignity for all to see, the man who had once dared to challenge the very foundations of society now reduced to nothing. The soldiers approached, their heavy boots echoing on the cold stone floor. And Turner's mind flickered between visions of fire and darkness, of judgment and redemption. But in his heart, he knew this was no salvation. This was no divine retribution. This was the end of the road, the moment where everything he had once believed in crumbled to dust. The door creaked open, and the light from the torches outside spilled into the room, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the floor. The faces of the guards appeared in the doorway, their expressions cold, indifferent. They stepped forward, their boots echoing against the stone, and as they approached, Turner's stomach twisted in a sickening knot. This was the moment. This was the humiliation that awaited him. And so, he was dragged out once more, his body shaking, his hands still bound, the crowd waiting, hungry for the fall of a once mighty man. Turner could hear their jeers, their mockery, their laughter. The eyes that had once feared him now looked upon him with nothing but disgust. And with each step he took, each ragged breath, he could feel the last shreds of his dignity being torn away. There would be no salvation. There would be no redemption. There would only be the fall of a prophet, the fall of a man who had once dared to defy the heavens. Now, nothing more than a broken soul in the dirt. The air on November the 11th, 1831, was frigid, thick with the sharp sting of impending winter, and the blood of men long lost to history. The crowd that had gathered outside the jailhouse was a sea of faces, blank and watching, their breath rising in little clouds of white, like the specters of those Turner had once led. They were drawn like flies to a carcass, not just to witness the spectacle of his final moments, but to claim ownership over the myth of his downfall. The ground beneath their feet was hard and unforgiving, the soil already trampled by years of indignities. The bitter scent of cold stone and burning wood clung to the damp air, mixing with the stench of sweat, tobacco, and the rotting leaves of late autumn. Nat Turner stood before them now, but he was no longer the fiery preacher who had once burned with a divine vision of vengeance. His face was gaunt, hollowed by days of confinement and starvation. His once proud figure had shrunken into the brittle frame of a man on the brink of collapse. His limbs trembled slightly beneath the thin, tattered rags that clung to his body. The swollen, bruised hands that had once held a machete, striking down his enemies with the fervor of a prophet, were now limp, shackled with iron as cold as the winds that tore at him. His skin, stretched over his bones, looked almost translucent, as though he had been drained of his essence, left hollow like a shell, waiting only to collapse. A wooden scaffold loomed before him, its towering frame casting long shadows in the early morning light. A noose hung there, swaying with the wind, dark and ominous, waiting for him. Turner's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the air biting at his lungs, every inhale a torment, every exhale a final surrender. He was a prisoner of his body, a prisoner of his mind, his purpose stripped away, leaving only the raw, gnawing fear that clung to him like a second skin. His mind flickered between moments of fevered clarity, fragments of visions, and dark thoughts that threatened to pull him into madness. The executioners were no better than the dogs who had once hunted him, their hands steady, their faces mask-like and indifferent. They were the tools of the state, the agents of a world that sought to crush him, to crush all he had stood for. Turner felt their eyes on him, cold and judgmental, but he did not fight. There was no fight left in him. His soul was as battered as his body, its once righteous fire now reduced to a faint ember, flickering weakly in the storm. He had once believed in the righteousness of his cause, the sacred weight of his divine charge, but now it all seemed so far away, like a distant memory of a man who no longer existed. His legs were forced to move, his body dragged toward the scaffold like a beast to the slaughter. He stumbled, his feet slipping on the cold stone beneath him, but there was no one to catch him, no one to help him. His hands hung limply at his sides, the shackles clinking with each hesitant step. The world around him seemed to shrink, the crowd's faces blurring into a sea of distorted shapes, their eyes fixed upon him, their gaze like 1,000 needles piercing through his flesh. He could hear their murmurs, their whispers, but they were like the howling wind, distant and meaningless, as if they belonged to another world. When they reached the scaffold, the noose was placed around his neck. The rope was rough against his skin, its fibers scratching against the raw flesh of his throat, a reminder of the finality that awaited him. His breath hitched in his chest, his heart pounding as though trying to break free of his ribcage. There was no escape now. His body, once a vessel for divine judgment, now felt like an empty husk, waiting to be discarded by the world he had tried to tear apart. He could hear the creaking of the rope, the sound of it tightening, drawing closer to the inevitable. The executioner stepped back, his face cold, impassive, as if this were nothing more than a routine task. Turner's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over one another. But there was no clarity, only the relentless pounding of his heart and the sickening sound of his own breath. He could feel the noose tighten, slowly, mercilessly, around his neck. The pressure built, a steady, unforgiving force that began to crush the life from him. His hands twitched, his fingers curling in a futile attempt to grasp at something, anything, to stop the suffocating weight of the world from coming down upon him. The crowd's murmurs turned into a hushed silence, the air thick with anticipation, and in that silence, the world around Turner seemed to slow. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, locked onto the far-off horizon, the blurred shapes of trees and sky beyond the scaffold. But there was nothing there. There was only the endless void, the place where the flames of his rebellion had once burned, now nothing but the ashes of a failed dream. His body swayed slightly, the rope digging deeper into his neck with every passing moment. But his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts spiraled into delirium, into the dark recesses of guilt and shame. The world spun, his vision narrowing as his life force drained away. But before the darkness took him completely, he heard the faintest whisper, a voice in the back of his mind, cold and distant but unmistakable. It is over. It